Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Sirine Hout. I am the chair of the English department at AUB, and I will be giving you this afternoon the lecture on Edward Said's Orientalism. I have taught English, not English, professional deformation. I have taught CVSP 204 many, many times in my life, but I'm not teaching it this semester. I miss it a lot, and I miss you guys, I guess, and girls, of course. So, and of course, Edward Said's Orientalism is one of my favorite texts, simply because he was my professor at Columbia University. When I was finishing up my PhD, he was actually my PhD #1 supervisor. So I'm very honored to have been asked again by the people in charge of the program to be offering this lecture on this seminal text of the late 20th century for the umpteenth time. I don't know, I think this is the 6th time that I offer pretty much the same lecture. And because you already have a handout literally in your hands, I don't think that it is necessary for you to be seeing what you already have in your hands up on the screen. Instead, I thought I would leave you with this scintillating view of some Orientalist paintings, which I will discuss in the course of my talk as we go along, okay? So, but please follow with me using the handouts in your hands so that you can get the most out of this lecture, okay? Thanks for your attendance ahead of time, and please keep it quiet because any disturbance will be disturbing. Okay, thank you very much. A classical pianist, an opera lover, a member of the Palestinian National Council between 1977 and 1991, a courageous defender of Palestinian human and political rights, a public figure with countless TV appearances, a much sought-after professor, a critic of literature, history, philosophy, the media, culture, music, the arts, and politics, a husband to a Lebanese woman, Mrs. Mariam Qortas, a father of 2 now grown-up children, and fortunately, as I just said, my former PhD thesis advisor at Columbia University in New York in the mid-1990s is Edward Wadi' Said, who was truly a Renaissance man. Controversial in his multifaceted work, Said had both admirers and, of course, detractors, if not downright political enemies. Those who loved him almost worshipped him, and those who hated him issued death threats and called him a professor of terror, as he once maligned in a magazine called Commentary, because he was photographed in southern Lebanon, Biljnoub, bin Naura, throwing a stone at an Israeli guardhouse, which was of course meant to be a symbolic gesture, although he explained later that this gesture was in fact symbolic and had not been aimed at any particular individual, not even a particular Israeli soldier. Columbia University, in the heart of Manhattan, where he worked all his life, never bothered to take these, of course, slanderous statements seriously. Furthermore, Harvard University tried to hire him, as I know, on many occasions, but he loved the cosmopolitanism and the thriving cultural scene of New York, calling Cambridge, Massachusetts, where Harvard is located, a conservative little village in comparison to New York, which he loved to call the capital of the world. Said was born into a wealthy Protestant family in Jerusalem before the, of course, occupation in 1948 on November 1st, 1935, when Palestine was still under the British mandate. He spent much of his childhood along with his 4 younger sisters in Cairo, Egypt, sometimes traveling to Jerusalem to spend time with relatives or to Beirut, Lebanon, in particular Dhur al-Shwer, during summer vacations. At the age of 14, he moved with his parents, who already had green cards, to the US, where he obtained his BA from Princeton University in 1957 and his PhD from Harvard University in 1964. In 1977, Edward Said became a member of the PNC, the Palestinian National Council, a provisional parliament established at the time with the goal of pursuing eventual Palestinian nationhood and an independent Palestinian state. In the early 1990s, he was diagnosed with chronic leukemia, which he battled for 13 years with the inclusion of experimental drugs, before succumbing to his illness on September 25 in 2003 at the age of 68 only, in his own apartment in Manhattan, very close to his beloved University, Columbia. He is buried in Brummana, Lebanon. You can visit his grave. Works and legacy. Roman numeral 2 on your handouts. Edward Said has written hundreds of articles on various subjects, has authored and occasionally co-authored over 20 books, okay? And some of them would be From Oslo to Iraq and The Roadmap, Parallels and Paradoxes, Explorations in Music and Society, Humanism and Democratic Criticism, On Late Style, and so on and so forth. To mention but a few of his books, I would also like to mention Joseph Conrad and the Fiction of Autobiography, which was actually originally his PhD thesis, Orientalism, which is our major concern today for this week. The Text, the World, and the Critic, Beginnings, After the Last Sky, The Question of Palestine, Culture and Imperialism, The Politics of Dispossession, covering Islam, and so on and so forth. They're countless, and you can read about them on the internet. Among the literary awards he received in his last years was one for lifetime achievement. They don't only get that at the Oscars. We also give that in the intellectual, in academic circles. That was bestowed upon him by Lenin Foundation in 2001, 2 years before he passed away. If you are interested in exploring the intricacies and the contradictions of his truly eventful life, and a very productive one, I recommend that you read his autobiography, which he wrote about his own life, titled Out of Place, or Kharij al-Makan, because it's been translated into Arabic and a zillion other languages, in 1999. Also, there's a 138-minute documentary titled Out of Place, Memories of Edward Said, by the Japanese filmmaker Sato Makoto, that was released in 2006. Filmed in Palestine, Israel, Lebanon, Egypt, and the US, it traces his childhood influences and celebrates his intellectual legacy. For more information, you can also busy yourselves reading Edward Said readers, and there are 2 or 3 that have come out, I would say, in the last 2 years. 2 of my colleagues are actually currently working, one in Germany and one in the United States, on also new books that haven't even come out yet on Edward Said. Okay. Roman numeral 3, titled Major Literary Historical Events in the Orientalist Tradition. Before we talk about Orientalism, the book, that is, and you're only reading excerpts, of course, as I remember, it is important to list some of the major literary and historical developments in the so-called Orientalist tradition. He actually coined the term Orientalism. Nobody had used it before as such, with the suffix ISM, as he did in 1978. But before we talk about various aspects and the major theses and tenets that are the foundation of this book, I will discuss quickly 4 major developments that have nothing to do with Edward Said, but that actually were taking place on the literary, historical, philological levels even in the 18th century. First, I would like to say that the 1001 Nights, or Alf Layla wa Layla as we call it, sometimes people call it the Arabian Nights, were compiled and translated for the first time between 1704 and 1717 by a French Arabist by the name of Antoine Galland. Now you might say, why is this such an important event? It is a tremendously important event because for the first time Europe had at its disposal a treasure trove of stories, of fables, of information, fabulous as it might be and as it is, about a world they didn't know much about beforehand. The 18th century also saw the earliest travelers to the Near East. I mean, the grand tour of the Middle East became kind of sort of a requirement for any gentleman. In addition to touring Europe, if you can afford it, if you can afford even more, you would actually also make the round and come to the Holy Land, visit Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and then go back to Europe. So the translation of this work into French and then into all pretty much other European vernaculars fired up the Western literary imagination following this major event, the Arabian Nights in translation. Second, I would like to mention a major discovery that was made by a British philologist by the name of William Jones, and he happened to be in Bengal in Asia in 1786, and he discovered Sanskrit, اللغة السنسكريتية. And again, you might say, why is that a big deal? It is a big deal because really until then, Europe had prided itself on knowing falsely or believing falsely that Hebrew, which is the foundation of what we call the Judeo-Christian tradition, was the original and the most ancient language in the world. So when Sanskrit was discovered, Of course, later on, the hieroglyphics were also discovered by Champollion in Egypt, but this is before Champollion. This is the late 18th century already. So Sanskrit was already seen and, of course, deemed as being more ancient than Hebrew. So this sort of shook the sort of the false self-righteousness and false consciousness of being in the center of the intellectual world. Third, I would like to simply mention that until the middle of the 18th century, Orientalists in Europe, meaning people who studied the Orient, were mostly interested really in the Quran, in translations of the Quran, in philology, in the Arabic language as a major Semitic language, of course, alongside Hebrew, which is also a Semitic language, and so on and so forth. So it was mostly until then, until the end of the 18th century, if you like, a textual approach, a philological approach, a translation-based approach to the Orient. In 1832, the term Oriental Renaissance, not Orientalism, that is Said's coinage, but Oriental Renaissance was coined by a Frenchman by the name of Edgar Quinet. And this is to differentiate this new wave of interest in the Orient from the earlier Renaissance, 200 years earlier or so, which had, of course, uncovered major ancient texts from ancient Italy and ancient Greece, which, of course, set the stage for the European Renaissance, or what we refer to as the Age of Discovery, beginning in the late 14th century, mostly in Florence, Italy, and then spreading across Europe. So this is the second Renaissance. It's an Oriental one in nature, and it looks east and it looks south. Away from the European continent. Now I'm going to turn your attention to Roman numeral 4, titled the book, Orientalism, which is his term. And I will talk first about its intellectual inheritance. In other words, what led to its creation on an intellectual level, and then what led to its creation on a personal level. Why Edward Said felt motivated in 1978 to write this book and not any other, although he's written 25 books, but why this book in 1978? First, the intellectual inheritance. That has little to do with his own personal upbringing or personal or political inclinations. There are two major thinkers. There are many others, but there are two in particular that I would like to single out as having had a major influence on Edward Said's own conception of Orientalism as a theoretical discourse based on, of course, also empirical findings and practice on the ground. And he himself, in his classes, which I attended and was enrolled in, showed a great admiration for two in particular. One is Michel Foucault, who is a French 20th century philosopher, and the other one is the Italian political theorist Antonio Gramsci. So what did he take from those two in particular that paved the way, if you like, towards the theoretical foundation of Orientalism as a notion, as a discourse, and even as a definition of a collective European practice? Following the ideas of Michel Foucault, Said emphasized the notion that knowledge is always political. This is very important for you to remember. No knowledge is really apolitical for Michel Foucault. And by political, I don't mean political in the narrow sense of the term, but as in being led by and influenced by power relations. That's what I mean by political. So power, according to Foucault, is always exercised rather than possessed. Because if you possess power and you do not exercise it, you might as well not have it. Okay? So, and also power for Michel Foucault is not localized in one particular body, say institution or government, but it infiltrates every aspect of your life in a given time period and in a given discourse, even sometimes in very subtle and nuanced ways that you are not capable of even tracking or being even completely aware of. So Foucault stressed the relationship between power and knowledge. This is very important in both scholarly and popular thinking. So in other words, if you have power, you will have more knowledge about that entity. And once you have more knowledge about that entity, you will automatically garner a greater political power with which to acquire even further knowledge. So it's like a snowball effect. The more power, the more knowledge, the more knowledge, the more power. And this is particularly relevant for Edward Said to describe Orientalism as a practice. They came, they colonized, they sat in our gardens and courtyards and were able to practice power. The longer they were here, they had more knowledge. The more knowledge, they were able to stay longer until, of course, they were eventually kicked out, right, during the age of decolonization and national struggles. So this relationship then between power and knowledge is a dialectical relationship and follows a snowball effect. Okay. what he took mostly from Antonio Gramsci is the notion of hegemony. This is a very important word, which in Arabic would translate into al-haymana. You hear it every day on the evening news or morning news, depending on when you watch the news, if you watch the news. And I think everyone should be watching the news these days because we are in very dangerous times. So, hegemony means haymana, right? And people and different nations and regions always try to sort of exercise power by dictating a certain lifestyle, a certain, a way of thinking, of living, of praying even over others. So for Edward Said, Orientalism is a discourse of hegemony, where the West assumes a position of superiority, be it political, moral, philosophical, even aesthetic, over a lesser entity, which it calls the Orient. Okay, I will talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So more often than not, the Orient appears as being inferior, even while it is being praised. It is still inferior on an infrastructural level. So for, as a Westerner, to even praise the Orient as being a certain aspect of the Orient, perhaps as having nicer or brighter colors in the morning than gloomy London, even that is predicated, according to Edward Said, on the very assumption that although the Levant might be better the sunrise might be more interesting to watch in the east than in gloomy London is what sent me to this place in the first place, to say that it has a better Levant than or morning rise or sunrise than I do back in London. This was a digression. Okay, so as you just heard then, the more familiar adjective other has also become recently a very much a used noun. The other, or al-akhar in Arabic, by the way. Al-akhariya is othering. You can also use it as a verb to other someone. It is now actually a word that appears as a verb in the Oxford English Dictionary. Yusuf Shaheen, the late former Egyptian, actually originally also Lebanese filmmaker, made a movie in 1999. It was actually titled Al-Akhar. So it has become a very popular term, has been for the last, I would say, 20 years. Okay, so I've talked about what led to Orientalism on an intellectual level. Now I'm going to talk about its intellectual progeny, not its inheritance, but rather its progeny, what came after and what it meant to do and what it tried to do and what it actually succeeded in doing. So Orientalism as a book has been extremely influential, but also controversial in post-colonial studies. It actually pretty much ushered in the notion of post-colonial studies as when it first appeared in 1978. So it was groundbreaking. It was very inspirational for many people. Two critics once said in relation to Orientalism that it also woke up other nations, that it wasn't just about the Orient. And by the way, when I say Orient, when Edward Said says Orient, we don't just mean us and maybe India and Japan. No, Orient is all that lies to the east of Europe and what lies to the south of Europe. So it would include the entire, what they like to call at the time, the dark continent or the African one. So the other is all that is not European. The Oriental is all that is non-European, non-Christian, non-white, non-bourgeois, non-middle class, non-French, non-English, Italian, and so on and so forth, to the south and to the east of Europe as a continent. Okay, the book has been translated into over 40 languages. In Arabic, if you prefer reading it in Arabic, the title is Al-Istishraq, is Orientalism. Okay, all right, so Said was asked several times in interviews to explain, why and when he conceived of Orientalism as a book when he did. And he said that this happened in the wake of the 1967 war. Harb al-Naksa, as I'm sure you have heard about, was a major defeat for Arab nations, especially for Jamal Abdel Nasser, after which he actually tried to resign from his post as the president of the Egyptian nation states. So, the event created in the United States at the time, where he was living already, okay, a huge anti-Arab sentiment. Of course, this was, made even stronger after the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center. Anyway, but we're talking about now the 20th, not the 21st century. So Edward Said, he says that he came to appreciate and to defend his Arab identity precisely when he started being attacked as an Arab. In the American cultural and political context. And so Palestine, he says, and by extension the Arab world, transformed for him personally from a memory of his boyhood into a reality, one which he felt needed embracing, illuminating, and fighting for. As he explains, quote, much of the personal investment in this study of Orientalism, he says, derives from my personal awareness of being an Oriental as a child growing up in two British colonies, Palestine and Egypt. So what does Said mean by the term? What is Orientalism? Now we get to the sort of meat and potatoes of the lecture. Orientalism is a discourse. Discourse in Arabic means al-khitab. And khitab doesn't mean speech as the one I'm giving now, or khutbah, that would be khutbah. But khitab means a whole way of living, believing, it's a whole ideological apparatus that you simply embrace, or not. Orientalism is a discourse then, encompassing a constellation, according to Edward Said, of very false assumptions, prejudices, if you like, stereotypes, underlying Western attitudes towards the East, which in metaphoric terms includes, as I said, all non-European, non-Christian, non-white, non-middle class countries to the east and to the south of the European continent. And this body of scholarship, which began to flourish in a systematic manner following the Napoleon Bonaparte's expedition to Egypt in 1798, quote, is marked by a subtle, according to him, and persistent Eurocentric prejudice against Arabo-Islamic peoples in particular, and that would include us and their cultures. In a magazine called The Nation, which is a very left-wing political journal to which he often contributed, Said sums up these stereotypes that the West has always had about the East as being mainly those of, quote, as we see often in cartoons as well, oil suppliers, as long as they have oil, I suppose, or potential, if not actual, terrorists. And that these cartoons and stereotypes are very essentialized, very crude caricatures of Muslim Arab males in particular that have persisted in the media, as he argues, in photo and print journalism, and now, of course, even in digital technologies, and possibly even less so, and perhaps on the social media, because that is a much more democratic and open-ended kind of medium for exchanges. So, of course, there are many movies that you can think of that you might have seen in the last 5 years, such as Syriana 2005 with George Clooney, who is now married to Amal Alamuddin, The Kingdom 2007, Rendition 2007, Black Gold 2011, and many others that have come out recently that you might want to think about if these movies, especially maybe in the last 2-3 years, have really tried, because most of them still tend to be Hollywood productions, if where the big money lies, lies in the double sense of the term, if they are still lying about many realities here, or if they're actually trying to capture a sort of truer sense of what Arab nations and what Arab peoples and how diverse they are in those movies. So there's a deeply entrenched tradition then of hugely inaccurate images, according to Said, and statements mostly about the Middle East and Asia and Western culture that has served as an implicit justification, mubarrir, for both European and American imperial projects in the region. And these imperial projects, of course, could be subtle, could be neons. I mean, now we talk about neo-imperialism, we talk about petro-imperialism, we talk about dollar imperialism. So imperialism is not just boots on the ground, right? It could be different forms of subtler sort of attempts at domination. So he argues then that in the Western mind, the Orient and the Occident, for most Western thinkers, philosophers, writers, poets, travelers, stand in contrast with one another as oppositional terms, where the Orient is almost always constructed as a negative inversion of the Occident. The Occident is the West. Now, as far as I remember, in this course you also read other people like Nietzsche, like Simone de Beauvoir and Thomas Mann. So I would like to do the following in the next maybe 10 minutes, which is to draw your attention to certain very important parallels or correspondences that exist really between the theoretical underpinning of Orientalism and concepts already sort of familiar to you that originated with Nietzsche or Thomas Mann or Simone de Beauvoir, whom you haven't read yet, I believe, or are reading, I'm not sure yet. Anyway, so Nietzsche in Beyond Good and Evil, which is of course a major philosophical text written in fragments, as you know, he had said that one of the errors that Plato had started was to make himself and the world always think in binary opposites, black versus white, the metaphysical world versus this one, and always giving a greater importance to one of the two members of that particular binary opposition. So if you take those two terms over, if you try to sort of apply them to this new discourse now, then clearly the West would have said about itself that it is in fact representative of all those positive foreground valuations, I think that's what Nietzsche called them actually, of each single opposite pairs, whereas the East would always occupy the lower values or the background valuations, if you like, of the same pairs. Yeah, in other words, whereas the West would enjoy appellations such as good and the mind and the soul and the afterlife, the West, the opposite would apply to the East, where it would have negative connotations. So if the West is progressive, the East is despotic. If the West is clean, the East lives in squalor, and so on and so forth. If they are democratic, we are not. Okay, so in other words, instead of viewing the Orient, according to him, in its infinite complexity, because all things in life are complex, and Nietzsche tried to remind us of that, that things mostly lie in the gray zone. Things are not black and white, should not be seen as black and white, although we have a tendency to view things as contrastive, because this is how the mind works, and we cannot change our own neurological infrastructure, but we should be aware of the fact that by always sort of binarizing, we are also distorting, and by distorting, we are falsifying. This is the sort of logical connection for Nietzsche. So in so doing, then, the Western mind may be viewed here again to invoke a Nietzschean concept as a particular and as an exaggerated case of a simplification apparatus. Nietzsche had called the mind, the human mind, a simplification apparatus. So this could be applied now to the collective mind represented by the West, according to Edward Said, which of course many people have taken issue with, but I'm now explaining Said before I tell you a little bit towards the end of this lecture what issues, what beef some critics have with his sort of generalizing statements made in Orientalism. So the Western mind is a simplification apparatus, according to Edward Said, when in its view of the Orient. Okay. Now, also, Freud, I think, is still a major pillar in CVSP 204. And as Europe's counter-image, I would like here to invoke Freudian terminology, which you are probably familiar with still, hopefully, from Civilization and its Discontents, and in which it is said that the East was portrayed as the place, or rather the playground, where the collective id within the European mental topography could, and in fact did, exercise erotic and aggressive tendencies and fantasies and get away with it. So in other words, Edward Said had talked about, if you remember, Eros and Thanatos, right? Eros is our innate love for, well, self-gratification, right? It's also the principle of life itself. It's the pleasure principle. But on the other hand, we have Thanatos pulling us in the opposite direction, right? The death drive or the aggressive impulses we usually like to sort of inflict upon others and sometimes come back to bite us because we end up inflicting them upon ourselves. So if you use these Freudian terms, Eros and Thanatos, then you could say by application that, or by extrapolation, that the East, in the view of the West, was this playground and also this battleground in which to exercise erotic and aggressive tendencies, respectively. A battleground for Thanatos and a playground for eroticism. And speaking of eroticism and nudity and lasciviousness, I would like you to have a look at this painting. I don't know who the painter is. It doesn't matter because they tend to sort of recycle themselves. Here you see, you know, basically an Arab man lying himself half naked on a couch, already basically flanked by a concubine, okay? And then you see this old man entering the room, who is obviously a slave dealer, right? And he has with him on his left side practically a completely naked woman, al-raqiq, as we call them in Arabic, and she is a bargaining, I mean, she is a commodity about to be sold for a certain sum of money to this sheikh, emir, whatever you want to call him, shah, I don't know, you know, pasha, because of course all these terms were also conflatable in the Western mind. And again, this is a scene that may or may not have taken place, maybe certainly not in those terms. I don't think any woman would come in completely naked to anyone's room in this sense when there are others present. So, but basically, what I'm trying to show you here is that this is how the West, how the West's erotic imagination was fired up by all themes and all topics Oriental. Okay, so you would, if you went to the internet this afternoon and you just put in the phrase Orientalist paintings, you are going to come across no fewer than 1,000 good and bad and ugly, paintings which basically thrive on this kind of recycled imagery that show the East as being a place of nothing but, you know, lechery and lasciviousness and over-sexuality and sexual indulgence, if you like. Now, the second painting is one of my favorites because I think it can be interpreted in a more subtle manner than the one I just showed you. And here you have an image from the hammam. You know what a hammam is, right? It's a public bath. And it's clearly one that is designed for women because it is the women who, again, are lying basically half naked. One is almost fully naked, but you cannot see the frontal parts. And the other one is sitting on a carpet. And there are other women or slaves in the background. And then you have this black figure that also is entering the room, like the old man in the previous one, holding what looks like a hookah or argile for these women to enjoy during their, you know, downtime, as we call it. And this is the actual painting. It's not that it's been cropped or the head has been cut off sort of by mistake or by design. No, this is the full painting. So you don't really know the identity of this black intruder, black-clad intruder, I should say. It looks like a woman, maybe a woman, may not be a woman. By the way, a lot of Western men disguise themselves as women, a practice that we are seeing today for other reasons, in order to enter Mecca, for example. Some converted to Islam to enter Mecca, but some also just dressed up as women with a full hijab, hence were not recognized as being men. So when I look at this painting, I mean, what strikes me as being a possible interpretation is that this person, this intruder, is the painter himself. This Western sort of, you know, curious mind, male mind, I have to say in this particular case, that has no actual access in real life to a hammam. I mean, no man would have access to a hammam, whether he's Western or Eastern. Only Western women were allowed into women's hammams. And so it's as if he is trying to create a way for himself, literally, into this not sacred, very profane place or secular place or whatever, recreational space, precisely because he cannot do so in reality. So this is where paintings show you more, according to Edward Said, about the mind of the creator, in this case, the Western painter, than about the place itself. Okay, so falsification happens not only on the level of the text, but also on the level of the image. And that is what I wanted you mostly to sort of get out of these two paintings. And there are many, many others that you are welcome to see on the internet and think about as well. Okay, so in short, then, the Orient becomes saturated with images of sexual overindulgence, and of course catering to both hetero and homosexual desires of Westerners, as we can see in many other paintings besides the two I have shown you, that include belly dancers, naked women in public baths, nude boys, which is the original dust jacket of the 1978 edition, and which we discussed in class. It is by Jerome, actually, the one that was featured on the cover of the original 1978 edition. And there you see a boy with a cobra around his naked body in the middle of a mosque, standing on a praying mat. And the mosque has actually a lot of ammunition hanging on its walls. And the people inside the mosque clearly come from different places that, you know, and when you look at that painting, you realize that this could never have happened in actual life. Okay, so it's a complete amalgam, as we would say, of spatial and temporal entities being brought together that would never exist in real life. Okay, all right, so, in case you are still reading Thomas Mann's Death in Venice, you can also, in your class discussions, compare the East to Venice itself. Because for Gustav von Aschenbach, the Venice is already the south of Europe. It is the place where he goes to relax, but also eventually to die, okay, as he does on the beach at the end of the novella. So what do Venice and the Orient have in common? This is something you might want to think about, in case you're still reading that text. Okay, the East came to be called many things. As I said, a playground for erotic fantasies, a battleground for aggressive fantasies. It was also the place for soldiers, academicians, colonial administrators. Benjamin Disraeli, a former 19th century British prime minister, referred to the East as a career. He said, the East is a career. A lot of people found themselves and made big money and basically charted their lives out in the East. Okay, so the main actors then in Orientalism, this discourse, as Said states, are really the French and the British cultures and empires that stretched from the beginning of the 19th century until the end of World War II. After World War II, you have US dominance. After all, the United States was the one that ended World War II with the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945, after which you see the rise of a new empire and the fall of the two previous ones. Of course, during the Renaissance, it had been Spain and Portugal, giving way now to France and Britain, both of now giving way to the US. So in short, in insisting on seeing and consequently representing the Orient not as it is, but rather as they would like it to be, a place devoid as in emptied out of its historical trajectory and steeped instead in an eternal, non-changing present with no vision for a better future or any future. Edward Said says, very crucially, the Orient is less a place than a topos for the Western mind. In other words, the Orient is much more of a metaphor that is based on all of these cliches and enduring stereotypes than an actual place, even if they were to visit this place and spend time in it. So again, it is not so much a place of geography and history situated in actuality, but rather a signpost, a marker, a signifier, a giant canvas, white canvas, on which all kinds of Western thinkers, painters, conquerors, travelers, novelists wrote or painted their own fantasies, repressed desires, and taboos. Okay, so now I take you to D, under main definitions of Orientalist discourse. Edward Said, in addition to calling the Orient less a place and more of a topos, says that it is actually a style of thought. So Orientalism, remember, is a discourse. It is more of a topos than an actual place, although it is a place. And then he adds also, and this is from, I think, the opening pages of the book, he says it is also a style of thought that is based upon an ontological wujudi. Ontology means al-wujudiyya, and an epistemological way of thinking, distinction between the Orient and the Occident. So as if there's this gap between the East and the West, based on ontology and based on epistemology, and may the twain, and the twain shall never meet, right? So, you know, you bridge it by going there, but somehow you can never really actually meet on an equal footing, okay? He also says that Orientalism is a Western style for dominating, for restructuring, and for having authority, and of course hegemony, as I said earlier, over the Orient. Okay, now letter E, capital E, what is the structure of Orientalist discourse? And this is important. It sounds fancy because he uses a lot of terms, actually many of which come from Freud, because he was a great lover of Freud. But they are not really all that, you know, difficult when you sort of get your teeth or, you know, into this. So according to Said, Orientalism is divided into three mutually reinforcing components. One of them is academic. That's easy. Orientalism is also academic in nature. People from, you know, starting centuries ago, started studying us. And some of them actually wrote good things and important things. So we should not dismiss things as being all false. Of course not. And by academic, I mean translations, philological, empirical, more recently sociological, anthropological studies of aspects that relate to the Orient, its languages, its peoples, its civilizations. The second aspect of Orientalism, according to Edward Said, is imaginative. In other words, it's not necessarily based on actuality, it's not based on empirical findings, but it's rather based on imagination. It's based on repression. It's based on, the irrational, based on, what lies more inside of you than what lies actually outside of your own consciousness and desires and what have you. And he also invokes the term imaginative geography, that oftentimes a lot of the cultural products rely not on an actual, but on an imaginative geography, as I try to explain via these two paintings. The third aspect is easy. It's the historical material aspect. This is the boots on the ground. This is when you actually see domination. This is what we saw during the colonial period, when the when the Egyptians were under the British mandate and the Palestinians as well, when we were under the French mandate, along with Syria, Iraq under the British, and so on and so forth. So, and of course, as I said, colonialism can also appear in subtler ways. So these three components, the academic, the imaginative, and the historical material, the boots on the ground, very importantly, according to him, strengthen one another. So they are mutually reinforcing entities, and they are actually a perfect example, in his opinion, of the lasting connections among history, society, and textuality. So in other words, painters benefit from actual findings. Findings might benefit from painters. The painters might benefit from the soldiers. The soldiers might be able to rule better based on academic findings. Again, the snowball effect. They are mutually reinforcing components, or if you like, arms of the same essential discourse he calls Orientalism. Second, he says that Orientalism also has two faces. So the first one was the three branches. Now I'm talking about two faces, if you like, or two levels. Okay, so first I was talking sort of along horizontally, now I'm talking in more vertical terms. He says Orientalism has a latent is a term he takes over from Freud, by the way, because Freud talked about dreams and being latent and having a latent content and a manifest content. So these terms are from Freud. And he says that Orientalism has two faces or two levels. One is latent. One is sort of an undercurrent of an unchanging, unconscious, sort of ideological doctrine based on a sense of entitlement and a sense of superiority over all that is not European. The manifest level of Orientalism is sort of the shallower level of Orientalism. And he says on the manifest level of Orientalism, we can see changing manifestations of color, of tune, of tone. But these are only related to form and style and genre. And in other words, if you look at, let's say, an opera inspired by, I don't know, Eastern music, versus a poem written by Gautier while he was sitting on the Bosphorus in Istanbul, versus a letter written by Kitchener while he was ruling over Egypt and the Sudan, he would say, obviously, on the level of things, at first glance, or at face value, this is the manifesto. They're very different. What does an opera have got to do with a poem or a letter? But on the doctrinal level, on the unconscious level, on the sort of the subliminal level, he would say they are all very much the same, based on the same vision, based on the same sense of entitlement and superiority vis-a-vis the East. So manifest is different, it's changing, whereas the latent is unchanging and conscious, and based on this essentialized difference, epistemological and ontological in nature, between West and East. So no matter, again, how different the manifest aspect is of any particular Orientalist cultural artifact, he insists that the ideological undercurrent or infrastructure remains the same, namely that of the superiority of the West vis-a-vis the East. So another quick thing I would like to talk about, and I will not go over time, I just need like another 5-7 minutes. He says emphatically that if you look at all that the West has produced about the East and as inspired by the East, if you look at all the letters written in the East about the East, the paintings in the East about the East, anything, operas, he insists on this point actually. He says that all of these products, cultural artifacts, enjoy a very strong internal consistency because they're all obsessed with one another, with quoting from one another to establish credibility and authority, as opposed to any genuine interest in actually corresponding with, on somewhat equal footing, and saying something genuinely sort of ground-based and sort of true to the facts coming from within the Orient itself. So in other words, the correspondence or the coherence, I should say, among the various artifacts produced by the Westerners about the East and Africa, of course, in this case, tend to be much stronger. The coherence among them is much stronger than any correspondence between this block of artifacts and the actual or real Orient. So this is why he says, in another context, Orientalism, and this is a quotation, Orientalism overrode the Orient. Orientalism overrode the Orient. It was much stronger than whatever the Orient was actually ever about or tried to represent itself as being. Okay, two more things, two more terms very quickly: strategic location and strategic formation. which have to do with what I'm saying. Edward Said says that all Westerners try to establish authority by pretending or presenting or both themselves as being outside of their object of inquiry, hence establishing a sense of exteriority. So exteriority implies also superiority. If I'm outside of what I'm studying, then I'm being objective, موضوعية, as we call it in Arabic. So this is what we call strategic location. Even painters, pretended to be outside of their paintings, but I'm trying to prove the opposite here by saying that I think the painter is imagining himself inside of the painting. Okay, so strategic location is presenting oneself as being outside of the actual object of inquiry. This has to do between the relationship between the Western author and the product. The second one is strategic formation, and this is simply what I said earlier. Strategic formation is how all of these products sort of glue themselves to one another and try to quote from one another and try to establish, and there's of course competition among them, but there's an obsession going on, especially among travelers. I wrote my PhD on travel literature. And it's amazing how newer travelers are always trying to align themselves, but also move away from already established lines of travelers that came before them, say, to a specific country. So this textuality is a major feature. This citationary nature of Orientalism is text-based, and it's a very dominant feature, according to Edward Said, in Orientalism, because again, Orientalism overrides the Orient every single time. They're more obsessed with one another, saying things about the East than they are actually even about the East itself. So to sum up then, these structural features, he says Orientalism at the end of the day is A, anti-empirical. It is not really an empirical tradition according to him. It is unexistential, a tradition, and precisely because it is more text-based and more author-based than it is object-based. Okay, the book is divided into 3 chapters. I'm not going to go into that. The scope of Orientalism, Orientalist structures and restructures, and finally, Orientalism now. The book has been, as I said, received in glowing, very, very happily by many, and some others try to distract or detract, I should say, from its importance by saying that in this particular book, Edward Said, these are the negative voices, did not pay enough attention to differences between men and women among the travelers, say, and that women may have had a different view of the Orient than their male counterparts. Other people have said that he did not pay enough attention to social class, because that is also a marker that he didn't pay attention to, that he was too generalizing in saying the West is the West. Others said Europe has its own interior inferiors, such as the Welsh, such as the Irish. How come they are not included, as if he was able to write about everything, and so on and so forth. All right, I will end with just 2 questions that you might want to raise in class amongst you, which I think are interesting. First, what does representing another culture mean today in the 21st century, in an age of what we refer to as globalism, in which we cannot live without the social media, almost on a daily basis? So what does this high-speed connection help us establish, help us overcome, perhaps, what we used to suffer from more in the past, which is this continual and sometimes mutual stereotyping? Do social media help us overcome that, or do they actually perpetuate certain cliches? Second, is the internet and the social media, like Facebook and Twitter in particular, sharpening or reducing intolerance? Ask yourself that question towards members of other cultures, religions, political beliefs, and what have you. Finally, and hypothetically, ask yourself that if you had the chance as a human being at this age, in this time and place, to actually be someone else, in a completely hypothetical scenario, if you could transform into someone that you now consider yourself to be completely in opposition of, or on the other side of the fence of, A, who would that person be that you think you are completely different from? Why? And if you were that person for 24 hours, the person that you cannot be unless magically you were transformed into being, what would you actually try to accomplish if you became him or her or them? Thank you very much.